welcome to the Jesus Movement Life. Welcome to everybody who's here and everyone who's joining us online tonight. Thank you for joining us. We continue on with our series from the Law and the Prophets, which of course is talking about two key things, as we mention every time. The fact that in order to know whom the Lord is, we need to know what the prophets say, because what they prophesy points to Jesus coming and also points to the second time that he will return. And of course the law defines the Lord himself and how he wants all of us to live. And Jesus said about the law that he didn't come to change it, he came to fulfill it, and hence it's a representation of whom he actually is. In this particular lesson, we're in Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, who is the second last minor prophet in our Old Testament, or the second last book of the Tanakh. And we're in chapter 5, and as we can see from the screen, there's two images on here. One of a woman in a basket, which is a bit odd looking, of course, and the other one is of this huge flying scroll. We can see the figure of this person here at the bottom. Tonight's lesson called Cleansing God's People. And so when we look at these two visions, oftentimes we recognise the vision, but what is their purpose? Zechariah is giving this to the people during the time of the Persian rulers. We're now in the time of King Darius, and of course he is there at the same time as Haggai, and he is a contemporary of Zerubbabel, who brought the first wave of people back from Babylon. And of course we have Joshua the high priest, whom we've already spoken about in 2 chapters earlier, chapter 3. And we're rolling from chapter to chapter, and there's 8 visions in all that Zechariah provides. And he gives these for the people at the time, and of course he's also speaking about future times as well. So we'll jump straight in, and we're going to read verses 1 to 2 of chapter 5. And in these 2 verses, it basically describes, first of all, what Zechariah saw. And so this, of course, is him speaking when he says, "I looked again, and there before me was a flying scroll. He asked me," so we're talking about the angel who's speaking to him, "he asked me, 'What do you see?' And Zechariah answers, 'I see a flying scroll, 20 cubits long and 10 cubits wide.'" And so he defines what he's seeing, and he defines what size that it actually is. So we have a flying scroll. Sounds a lot like an Aladdin movie, perhaps, for people in modern times. But it's in a vision, and of course it wouldn't have been something that's normal at those times, as it's not now. But he sees this flying scroll flying through the air. Now, from this, we know that the scroll was unrolled. You might see some images, and sometimes it shows them with the 2 ends scrolled around I'm not sure the correct terms, but the pieces of wood at either end. But you see them doing like that. But in this case, he actually gives us a measurement, which tells us that the scroll is actually open and flat. And we have this flat picture which represents this, but like many images, of course, they're wound up at either end, and that's not the case. So it's almost like the thinking about a flying carpet, if you will. And we know this is said because it's rolled open, and we can learn how large the scroll is. So I could ask a really difficult question and say, how big is something that's 20 cubits long by 10 cubits wide? And it'll probably be like not sure what that is.
It's 200 square cubits.
Very good. This is really helping us a lot.
30 feet long and 15 foot wide.
Oh, good man. Someone's reading their subscripts on their Bible.
It's actually written
in this version, that's right. So yeah, depending on your version, will give you the... So it's 15 by 30 feet, which is equivalent to 4.5 metres by 9 metres. So it's a decent size scroll, isn't it? Now, why why do we see this scroll and why does it give the measurements? So we know the measurements now. It's a really obtuse question, I know, but what does the dimension represent? I mean, in the Bible, we get given information sometimes, and it's never for no reason. It's not just to have an idea of how big it is. It's actually a vision. It's to do with the Lord. It's a flying scroll, and this measurement is akin to something in the Bible which is described to us. So you'd have to be a bit of a regular scholar to know this one. Anyone have any understanding what it is?
Is it the size of the inner room?
Good, you're really close, but not the inner room. But it is connected to the temple.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the key, isn't it? Because what's the whole point of what's going on at this point in time? These people were sent back from Babylon to do what? To rebuild the temple, of course, the altar that goes with it. So when they were sent back under King Cyrus the Great, the whole mandate was that God spoke to King Cyrus and said to release the people, give them what they need, and send them back to rebuild my house, my temple. And so this measurement is actually connected to that. So who would like to open their Bible, go to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 3, and then you can tell me what the answer is. So 1 Kings, if you're watching, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 3.
Kings chapter 6 verse 3. The vestibule in front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house.
Aha! So those measurements are exactly the same.
Yeah.
And the vestibule, what's another word for that? Maybe a more modern word for that would be something that you'd have your rocking chair on outside your house while you watch the sun go down and drink a cup of tea, perhaps. You would call it your porch. So at the entrance to the temple, there was a set of stairs that went up, and then there was a balcony or a porch or a vestibule that had two great pillars on there. And this gives us the dimension for that entrance space, that flat space before you then step up again into the temple itself.
The Hebrew word is Haggai.
Right, Haggai.
Yeah.
So these are the dimensions that are given for the temple. So this vision is connected to the building of the temple. So when we think about what Zechariah is doing, he's there to, what was his purpose, what we've learned so far? What has his visions been purposed to? What are they talking about? What are they getting the people to do?
To start working again.
Right, because we learned that in the book of Haggai they started to build the temple. We learned from the book of Ezra that they stopped after 4 years, and then they begin a big gap of time, 16 years, where there's nothing happening because they're frightened of those who are opposing them. And then we have Zechariah come in, and he's saying, why have you stopped? Trust in the Lord. He reinstates Joshua as the high priest again, and he's there to push everybody and give them the visions of the Lord, to get them to be encouraged to begin to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem again. And so in this vision we see this situation whereby we're given the dimensions in this actual vision. So now we're getting down to kind of like the nitty-gritty, aren't we, of what's happening. Okay, so let's read verses 3 to 4 of chapter 5, and we'll find out what the scroll represents. And it reads, and he said to me, so again this is the angel speaking to the prophet Zechariah, who he's now telling to the people of Jerusalem. This is the curse that is going out over the whole land, for according to what it says on one side, every thief will be banished, and according to what it says on the other, everyone who swears falsely will be banished. The Lord Almighty declares, I will send it out, And it will enter the house of the thief and the house of anyone who swears falsely by my name. It will remain in that house and destroy it completely, both its timbers and its stones. And so we're getting this perception that it has a power to it. Well, the object doesn't, but what's written on it does. And so this is the message that's behind it. So what do you think is going on from what's being said here? It's saying it's a flying carpet, which means it's going to be going out. It's not literally flying. It means that it's going to travel around the land. So in other words, the words of the Lord are going to travel around the land, and it gives a warning to the people that if they don't begin to do what the Lord says, that there will be a curse that comes upon them. Now we might recall that when they stopped working, what did they do? They focused on building their own homes. And what did the Lord send in order to give them a punishment, if you will, for doing that, taking their sight of what he was commanding them to do? He sent a famine. There was drought and there was a famine, and that went for several years as well. And so he sends out this warning, and what's this warning got embedded in it? Everyone who swears falsely will be banished. What do you think that is pertaining to?
Well,
Swears falsely. What's that mean?
I see it as, I mean, the thief, I know it's the thief side.
Yep, okay,
The,
yep.
the thief side is more or less most of the commandments, because, you know, like you're stealing someone's wife, you know, all of them would include some form of stealing, taking,
Yes.
and the reverse of that would be using the Lord's name in vain, or actually using his name falsely, or
Very good.
using the name of false gods and idols.
Yep.
So basically all encapsulates the Ten Commandments.
Right. But any other thoughts? It says here that the curse will go out over the whole land. For what it says on one side, every thief will be banished, which means, what's the implication of that?
Stealing from people.
Right? But they'll be banished. Banished means to cast out, right? So what do you think that means? What did the Lord promise his people in the land right back to the time of Abraham? They were each given an inheritance, and in that inheritance they were given land, and the Lord said they would prosper and he would give them provision. You know, it was the land of what? Milk and honey. It would have olive trees, it would have vines, you know, all the crops that he would provide, etc. And so what he's saying, he's going to banish them, which means that they're not going to receive what the Lord has for them. So their inheritance is going to be affected by their behaviour, and also especially by their belief. Now, people who pay lip service, who live in the land and say, well, I'm a Jewish person, therefore I'm entitled, he's basically saying here that if they don't follow God's laws, the blood doesn't matter, you're going to be cast out, cursed, and you're not going to receive from God. So to steal in this situation means that they're going, because they're talking about a thief. So when we talk about a thief, we're talking about theft, which implies that something has been stolen, doesn't it? And it says, I will send it out and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of anyone who swears falsely by my name. So a thief is someone that takes from,
Or what doesn't belong to them.
right? But who are they taking it from? They're in the land. So if they're going to take something, they're going to take it from their neighbours, literally. Their neighbours are God's people. And so it's like they're taking from him indirectly, but they're God's people. So in other words, if you're not going to walk with the Lord and you're going to take what's his from his people, then he's going to banish you and cast you out. And so therefore that becomes the curse, right? Jesus says the same. It goes right back to Abraham when they talk about the curse, right? It means that you are banished. Let's go all the way back to the book of Genesis. What happens with Abel and Cain? It says that he is cursed. And what happens when he's cursed? He is banished away from God's presence and from what God has to offer them for. So he was cast out of the Garden of Eden, the place of provision and the Lord's presence, into the land of Nod, as the Bible says. But the word Nod and the land of Nod is not a place. In Hebrew, it actually means the land of wandering. So they were cast out to the east, and they had no home, no place, no family. And so he's saying that when he banishes them, or they're being cast out, it means they're going to end up outside of their inheritance, outside of the land that God has them, and they're not going to have a home. So in other words, they're going to have to go and wander and establish themselves somewhere else. And so it's a severe penalty, and he's warning the people because they have stopped doing what God commands them to do, and they focused on building their house, not on building God's house. So he's saying, if you're not going to fulfill what I've commanded you to do, then I'm going to take your house away from you. So hence the mention of the house. Now, obviously, anyone who swears falsely by my name, it's probably fairly straightforward. If you swear falsely by your name, that means you're using the Lord's name in vain. And of course, you would be using it on the pretense of being a follower or a subject of the Lord, and of course, expecting the fruits that come with that. But the Lord's saying, if you are someone that does that, he knows who you are, and you're going to get cast out from amongst the rest. So when he says that he will send out a curse, there's a couple of sins, one on each side of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, representing all of Israel's sin. You might remember when they go into the land of Canaan, they go to the mountain, and there's a mountain on either side up at Shechem, and on one side there's 6 tribes, on the other side there's 6 tribes. 6 of the tribes are blessed, 6 of the tribes are cursed. And so this notion of cursing and blessing carries right throughout the Bible, right from the beginning. Okay, so we're going to go into the second portion of chapter 5 now, and this talks about the vision of the woman in the basket. So I'm sort of picturing her folding her arms and climbing in here, and you can see that there's a lid on the basket behind her. And so of course this all represents something as well. So we're going to read verses 5 to 8 of chapter 5, and it's about the woman who's sitting in the basket. It begins, then the angel who was speaking to me came forward and said to me, look up and see what is appearing. I asked, what is it? Why does the angel, just on this, because we've mentioned this a few times, the angel says looking up. So what does that tell you? If you ask him to look up.
Well, he's not focusing on the visions.
Yeah.
He's looking down.
No,
He's looking down.
he tells them to look up, but what's he seeing? What's a person seeing if they're not looking up? They're seeing what's before them. So when he says to look up, they're looking up to heaven and the vision that's being given to them. And so in other words, what they're seeing is a vision, it's not what's before them. And so this separates that this is a vision given to man on earth, looking up, that's given from heaven. So the vision comes from heaven, and the person viewing is there on earth looking up at the vision. And this is always the case, because sometimes when they're talking, there's things happening around them. So you might notice when we read before there, it talks about the land and the curse and all that sort of stuff. It says to look up and see the scroll, but when they're talking about the houses and all the rest of it, there's no look up. It's everything that would normally be around them. Okay, so look up and see what appeared. I asked, what is it? He replied, it is a basket. And he added, this is the iniquity of the people throughout the land. Then the cover of lead was raised, and there in the basket sat a woman. He said, this is this is wickedness. I shouldn't smile when I say this. This is wickedness. And he pushed her back into the basket and pushed its lead cover down on it. So, how's all your thoughts going right now? There's a basket with a woman in it who represents iniquity. She's pushed back inside, and this lid of lead is slid back across the top. So the lead, you might go, oh, okay, it's heavy, so that means that it'll close the basket and she won't be able to get out. But it has obviously a meaning as well. So first of all, anyone know what the basket represents? The physical basket. There's a person of a size going in a particular... I mean, the basket's not this big. It's not this big. It's the size that fits this woman inside.
Wasn't it the size of an ephah, which was carried a certain amount of grain?
Right, so it's a measure.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So it is a measure, and it is an ephah, and it's talking about a measure of what's inside?
A measure of sin.
Sin. Okay. So the basket of an ephah, and it has a lead discs on the lid. What do you think the lead disc represents?
I was trying to find what it represents. Is it to do with untrue scales? You know, like
Right.
they used weights to...
So you're on the track with weights and scales, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Do you think lead was a common and easy substance for someone to find in those days? It was used because it was a soft metal, and it was used, very early on in the piece, but it's not something you walk down the road and go, oh look, here's a rock full of lead, so to speak. It has a purpose. So lead itself were units of measurement connected to scales. So in other words, when they would measure an ephah of grain, there would be a scale by which it was weighed, and it was weighed, counterbalanced by lead. And so there's all these different lead weights. And so we know that they go together. And of course, all of those things, what are they a symbol of? An ephah of grain in a basket, lead, scales. What's all that about? What's it talking about? Why are we actually measuring something? Why are we using scales in the first place? Why do we have a basket of grain? What's the relationship of that?
Is it to do with measuring the sin?
Well, that's you're jumping the next point, but what's just the simplicity? I mean, if you came to me and said, I want an ephah of grain, you go, okay, give me a basket, I put it on the scale, I put the weights on the scale, and I keep filling up that basket until such time as it levelled off with the weights, right? So what's the whole purpose of that?
Quantifying.
You're quantifying it for what purpose? It's
For true reading.
It's commerce. You're trading. You're actually taking something that's been produced, you're measuring a portion, and then you would no doubt be, we could call it giving, but you would be selling it to someone else. So it's a measure of commerce. So this is connected to that measure of commerce. What were people doing in the land? Were they building the temple, or were they trading and going about their business, building their houses, trying to re-establish their wealth? So in other words, they were in this materialistic world, carving out their little business again, carving out their means of living, building their homes, having their kids. The focus was on commerce. It wasn't focused on building the temple. And so the Lord shut down the commerce, and what did he do? He sent a drought, which gave a famine, which of course would stop what? Commerce, grain. And so he measures sin by focus on personal gain. And so if people's personal gain is just for personal gain, and people aren't doing it for the Lord, for their family, for a greater purpose, he's saying that this is where iniquity is birthed from. And it's true. We know this happens. So we have to, there's a message for us in this, isn't there? Because we all go to work, we work hard to achieve things, to earn a good income, have a good lifestyle, But if that's our sole purpose, then the Lord's going to be measuring us on those scales of iniquity as well. So something there for us today. Okay, wickedness. There's an association here with the woman in the basket and the weight being associated with wickedness. So do you think that this is about a female or it's about a symbolism? Yeah. So this is not a go at men having a go at women. So the woman in the basket and the weight are all associated with wickedness, and so they're images of greed, materialism, and in fact dishonesty for profit. The Lord tells us, and we read this in the Bible, and Jesus speaks about this, about people using dishonest scales. In other words, they're weighted on there. Now you may notice that the lid on the ephah had what? Lead. So what would that do to a scale? Make it uneven, right? And so they would have to put more in to counterbalance that lead. And so we see this imagery coming through of dishonesty for profit. Now the reason that anyone want to hazard a guess why they use a female as a symbol for wickedness? Eve. It's a good analogy, but it's a.
I know that they used the prostitutes to turn the Israelites originally when they were going to be blessed with Canaan.
Right.
They actually used the prostitutes to turn them from.
Right. So they were wicked,
Yeah.
and they turned them men to evil.
And it seemed to be the only thing that would turn them.
Right. So, or a good steak, I think, was a bit of a challenge at the time as well. After all that manna in the desert for 40 years, they kind of like wouldn't want a bit of the barbecue, so they went up for the women and the barbecue, so to speak. So, where this actually comes from is the Hebrew language. In Hebrew, the word for wickedness is feminine. That's as simple as that. And so this is where that's where the knowing the language makes a difference. So the word for wickedness is a feminine word because it has a gender-related language. And so this is the connection with the female. So when we read it in English, we associate it as a female form rather than the female form of language. And so it's a difference in the written word.
Don't they say she is Babylon as well?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And there is an evil connotation to that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is that association all the way through. So, just as you quite quickly got in, Zechariah actually prophesied to those who returned from where?
Babylon.
From Babylon, Babylonian exile. So God's people had come from Babylon with a materialistic problem, and this vision spoke of this problem. You might recall when they actually came back with huge wealth.
Oh, yeah.
The spoils that were in Babylon, King Cyrus gave them a huge amount of this, but what was it to be used for? Building the temple. But they stopped building the temple after 4 years, so what did they use all the dosh for?
Themselves.
Used it for themselves.
Trading.
Get the crops, trade, build the houses, and so we see a misappropriation of funds.
There's the thief straight off.
There's the thief, that's right. And so we start stitching together those elements. Now it says that he thrust her down into the basket and slid or threw the lead cover over the mouth or the top of the basket. So of course, by doing this, anyone want to hazard a guess what that is? Who's the person who pushed her down in the basket? Or it's a vision.
The angel?
You can say the angel, but he was actually showing the vision. So he was actually beside Zechariah, so no.
So God.
It was God. And it says that God was pushing her down the basket and sliding the lid across. What's God demonstrating by doing that?
Well, he just won't tolerate it.
Right? So he's demonstrating his authority, his power over evil. And then when we read the next verses, we find that this basket's going to be returned to Babylon. And so he actually demonstrates his authority over evil, and then he removes the wickedness from Jerusalem altogether. And so this is how the imagery comes together. So let's read the last verses from verse 9 to 11 from Zechariah chapter 5. And this talks about the woman and the baskets I just mentioned being returned to Babylon. So once again, what does Zechariah start with? Then I looked up, and there before me were two women with the wind in their wings. They had wings like those of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between heaven and earth. Where are they taking the basket? I asked the angel who was speaking to me. He replied, to the country of Babylonian, to build a house for it. When the house is ready, the basket will be set there in its place. So, we have an image now of a woman representing wickedness inside the basket, and the employment of two winged women to fly the basket across with the wings of a, it says, not of any bird, it doesn't say of an eagle, it says of a stork. Right. So what does it conjure up with the wings of a stork? Any ideas? It's not the modern day idea of delivering babies.
It's delicate, isn't it? It's not, like an eagle is sort of powerful.
Yes, so it's you could say an eagle's obviously a hunting prey style of imagery.
Oh, right, so it's not a bird of prey, it's
right.
like peace almost.
Right. But what do you picture when you see a stork? What happens when a stork unfolds its wings and starts flapping?
It's elegant.
It's elegant. What about these things?
Span?
Right, they're big. I've actually ridden a motorbike under a bird taking off up in the Northern Territory of Australia here, and it's their state bird. It's not a stork, it's the Australian version of a stork, but it's huge. And when it takes off and it goes like this, I literally had to duck, and this bird was significantly huge. So the thing that really came at you was the size of the wings. So this means that the vision had big wings flying this basket. So it means that they're capable of carrying it all the way to Babylon. So it's a symbol of size and strength. Now there's some people who have determined that the stork wings are associated with the fact that a stork, biblically, is deemed as an unclean animal. Do you know why? What's deemed as unclean? Why is an animal ever deemed unclean in the Bible? What's one of the descriptors about what determines something's unclean? For example, why is a pig unclean? Because it has a cleft hoof, right? There you go. Yeah. So, what does a stork have? It's not like duck's feet. It has cleft, if you will, toes. So there's an association with it being unclean, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. This is not what the Bible says about them. It's an association thing where people are trying to deem why, but what it is, it's about these big, powerful wings that can fly for a long distance. Storks are birds that fly long distance. They're seasonal. They'll be in the cold climate. They'll fly halfway around the world and land in a warm climate for the season, have their babies, and then fly back to their climate again. So they're long distance birds, hence why God gave them long winds to float on the currents. So for all you pilots, you should all get this right. Now, where are they carrying the basket? We've said this. They're carrying it, of course, to Babylon, or what we call the ancient land of Shinar in the Bible. And so God will cause this evil, materialistic spirit to return to its starting place. So Babylon, the land of Shinar, is where civilization first started after the flood.
Babel.
Right. So it's Babel, it's a place of rebellion, and so this rebellion has come from that land. God sent his people back to that land to be punished. He brought them back out of slavery from that land, and now he's sending that represents evil back to that land to be punished again. So what they're basically saying is, if we go all the way through to the book of Revelation now, what happens to Babylon in the book of Revelation? It gets annihilated, it gets destroyed. And so the eventual position of all evil is that it goes and gets destroyed. And so this is a symbol of he will destroy everything that's evil. So he sends it back. Now, the last thing on this is that he talks about that when it's ready, that the basket will be set there in a house or on a base in a house. And so this word base, anyone want to hazard a guess what that means? It's probably easier in Hebrew again. What does a base hold? So we have a base. What do? We put something on top of it, right? So a base is like a pedestal. Right? What do they put on pedestals or bases in these days?
Gods.
Right. False gods, man-made idols. And so putting it on its base means that it represents, it's a pedestal for an idol. And so the idol in this case is the materialism of mankind. And so he says he'll send it back, this evil, back to where it comes from on this pedestal. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the whole origin of Babylon was that they were building a tower to reach the heavens, and so that they wouldn't need a god. So they were arrogant, they had their own pride, and they would build their own power. Everything was also associated with height. So if you're to be a god or a heavenly being, someone that's all-powerful, they always associate it with height. You go around the world today, what do we all still try to do? Build the tallest building, right? What do they do with pyramids? They built these pyramids for height. They could have made little ones, they could have put someone in a coffin, but they didn't. They built these massive things in the sky. Why? Because the height, the ziggurats in the time of Abraham in the land of Ur, all of these were built. You can go to South American countries, Mexico, they all had these forms of pyramids. They were always built because these places of height was associated with false gods or gods. What does the Bible talk about throughout the land? That people would go and worship false idols in high places. And so this association with the pedestal is that it's up high and it's associated with a false god. And always he's sending this evil back to this false god, and he will destroy this enemy at the end of times.
Satisfied.